So glad to have back on the program David Nir, political director at Daily Kos, also a host of The Down Ballot, the Daily Kos podcast that you can go and listen to wherever you listen to your podcasts and get the great political analysis. Welcome back to the program, David Nir.
Mike, it is a real pleasure to be back.
So you wrote about, and I wanted to get into this because people have been so worried about gerrymandering and looking at what Republicans have done and certainly what the Supreme Court has done. You wrote about Michigan and Pennsylvania and both places where we've seen Republican attempts to gerrymander really beaten back by Democrats and by the people. And because of that, things look good there. Talk a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that I want to say is I know you care about these state races a lot, Mike, and I really do as well. And they are so important because it's in these state legislatures that Republicans are passing their abortion bans. It is where gerrymanders are born. And it's also where Donald Trump is hoping to steal the next election. He wants these far-right Republican lawmakers to simply override the will of voters and replace slates of electors with electors loyal to Donald Trump. So these races never get enough attention, but they really deserve a ton of attention. And as you mentioned, things have really changed in two major swing states, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Obviously, we know these are closely divided states. They went for Trump in 2016. They went for Biden in 2020. But despite that swing state status, both of them have had Republican legislatures with basically unshakable Republican majorities for many years, in Michigan decades. And the reason is simple. It's just gerrymandering. Republicans have always been able to draw the maps, and they have drawn maps to ensure that they never lose. That finally changed in both states for totally different reasons. In Michigan in 2018, voters approved an amendment to the state constitution that completely reformed the redistricting process. It put in place an independent redistricting commission that drew much fairer maps that finally give Democrats a real chance to actually win the state legislature. And something similar happened in Pennsylvania, but by a totally different route. There, Democrats made a huge effort to win back the state Supreme Court in 2015. And I know that may sound strange, but it's the state Supreme Court that picks the tiebreaker on the state's redistricting commission. And that tiebreaker decides whether you're going to get GOP gerrymanders or you're going to get fair maps. And for the first time in a long time, the state Supreme Court was held by Democrats, and they appointed a very fair-minded tiebreaker who, with the state house in particular, sided with much fairer maps. And so now in both of these enormous swing states, Democrats are actually poised to potentially win majorities this fall, and if not this year, then to be in a much better position in 2024 than they have been in an incredibly long time.
And that is so important because these legislative bodies have so much power, and Republicans have actually given them more power, and they want to give them even more power with the Supreme Court as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What state lawmakers do can affect our lives in so many ways. And it really just goes from top to bottom, whether we're talking about labor laws or criminal justice or environmental laws and climate change. And really, the actions of these state legislators are criminally undercovered, and it's certainly understandable, but regrettable, given the hollowing out of the traditional media. But that's why it's so important for the folks listening to this show to pay attention to these races. And also, it's not just the stuff that they do in their capacity as lawmakers that matters. it's their extracurricular activities as well. A number of far-right Republican state legislators, people elected to create and uphold the laws of their states, went to the Capitol on Jan 6th and participated in the riots there, or at least watched from a very close distance. Many of them, get this being Trump's GOP today, are also election deniers. And so they are standing ready to do Trump's bidding in 2024 if he doesn't win the vote again. So there are just a lot of really, really scary lawmakers, hundreds and hundreds of them. The DLCC, that's the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, has been tracking these ultra MAGA extremists, and they are legion. And so if Democrats can win in Michigan and Pennsylvania, we will be helping to turn the tide against this wave of extremism and also put in place a huge bulwark against Trump and the GOP stealing the next election.
Well, and when I mentioned the Supreme Court, I was referring to the court taking up this case that would give enormous power to legislatures when it comes to elections. Power they don't have now, but power Republicans, of course, are hell-bent on making sure that legislators have to basically make decisions about how votes are counted and how elections turn out, what the outcome of elections are.
Oh yeah. I mean, you what you are talking about, Mike, is really the single scariest thing that is on the Supreme Court's docket right now. We're talking about something that's been termed the independent state legislature doctrine, and that sort of anodyne, boring name should not fool anyone. This is a far right doctrine that is totally made up, completely ginned up. And what it says is based on a completely tendentious reading of the Constitution. This doctrine argues that state legislators and state legislators alone can set the terms of federal election law in the states. And what that means is, according to this reading, that state courts can't rule that something that state legislators do with regard to federal election law violates the state constitution. It probably even says that voters can't place measures on the ballot to change the way that states conduct federal elections. And in its most extreme version, it even suggests that governors don't have the power to veto laws passed by state legislatures, because this law says that state legislatures are the supreme power when it comes to setting federal election laws. It has no basis in history. It's a completely absurd reading of the Constitution. But of course, what does that matter? Because the supermajority of far-right justices on the Supreme Court doesn't care about precedent. We know that. They don't care about the rule of law. They care about raw and naked power. And there is a really good chance, Mike, that they are going to agree with this ridiculous independent state legislature doctrine. And a whole host of laws and state court decisions could be overturned as a result. And just as one example, this would include the North Carolina Supreme Court ruling that the GOP's maps illegally gerrymandered both Congress and the state legislature, and they swapped in much fairer maps. The Supreme Court is poised to say no. The state Supreme Court has no power over the state legislature, and that is just totally anti-democratic and totally absurd. And unfortunately, there's very little we can do about it if the Supreme Court rules against us.
Right. I mean, it's allowing for the gerrymandering and then allowing those gerrymandered those lawmakers elected through gerrymandering to just set the election law for till the end of time, basically, and keep themselves in office.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We already have so many Republican-held state legislatures across the country that, as you point out, are ill-gotten, that they have these majorities precisely because of existing gerrymanders. And, so many of these right-leaning judges at all levels take this very too clever by half sort of tack, and they say, well, if, voters don't like these laws, they can vote in new legislators. Well, yeah, good luck with that. The whole point is that the crappy unconstitutional laws are these gerrymanders that make it almost impossible to vote these people out. So really, it's man, I don't know, Mike. It's really almost a belief in democracy in name only.
Right.
A form with no substance, and it's part of this very scary authoritarian movement that we have really been witness to for a long time from the Republican Party, but that's crescendoed in the age of Trump.
And that's why when people see what happened in New York, and I wanted to ask you about it, they go, wow, really? Like Republicans are able to do this, but you're saying this? You and I have talked about New York and the new maps before, but I don't think we've talked about it since everything went down. um, New York lawmakers voted to have a redistricting commission that would determine the new maps, and the governor had signed the bill. Um, Democratic governor, Democratic lawmakers. The law was that if the commission couldn't determine it, it would go back to the legislature. The commission deadlocked. There were new maps created. They were more modest than some people had wanted them to be in terms of how they, broke down. Nonetheless, it was challenged in court. A lot of people were really surprised that right up the line to the highest court in New York, it was struck down, and then new maps were created by an outside, I guess, an independent judge who was brought in, right? Or maybe you know more of the details, but we now have these new maps, and I want to get your thoughts on the process and then where things stand now.
Yeah, I think the process went completely awry. What wound up happening is that the New York courts ruled that even though this commission that you mentioned had deadlocked, the legislature still lacked the power to draw new maps. And the whole thing felt kind of absurd because you have a deadlocked commission. What is New York supposed to do? In the decision that New York's highest court put out, it was almost fantastical in what they were suggesting, what the majority was suggesting that lawmakers should have done, or that New York should have done. Essentially, basically, make the commission go back into a room and keep berating them until they produce a compromise. And that was never going to happen because that commission was divided equally between Democrats and Republicans. It was almost designed to fail. But stepping back a foot or two, what really happened here is that Andrew Cuomo appointed every member of the court that made that decision. And over the years, he had appointed a number of very reactionary judges to this top court in New York. It's called the Court of Appeals. It's not called the State Supreme Court.
Right.
And these judges, you look on paper, oh, well, they were appointed by a Democrat and confirmed by, in some cases, by a Democratic run state Senate. They were by no means progressives. They have been ruling against defendants in criminal justice cases. They have been siding with developers and landlords against tenants repeatedly and regularly. So ultimately, what it really feels like happened here is that Andrew Cuomo, who was a schmuck and who himself was an extreme reactionary and by no means a progressive or even liberal, appointed terrible judges to this court, and they issued a terrible ruling. And what it points to for me, Mike, is the huge importance that state Supreme Courts play. And in some states, of course, voters get to elect those judges directly. In others, they're appointed by the governor. But also, something really important to remember is that some of these judges who sided against these maps had been confirmed by a Democratic state Senate. They were warned. They said, please, progressives said, please do not confirm these judges. And they did anyway. So, God, I'd like to think that hopefully they know better now. But man, I'm not optimistic. So now New York is stuck with a map that was created by a judge, or approved by a judge, a Republican judge in the far reaches of upstate New York. Yes, it was drawn by an independent map maker, but I really don't think this is the system that voters had in mind when they voted for this redistricting commission in the first place.
And now it's going to be interesting to see how these do. We only have like 30 seconds. Do you think these maps, though, are better than the original maps?
I mean, better than
This map is better
no,
than
they're
the
not better
original.
for Democrats.
Okay.
I got to say that.
Okay. Okay. Um, Still, it's interesting to see, and I guess this will be another discussion. That Republicans did not win that New York 19 that they thought they were going to win, and they're worried because of the issue of abortion really, creating a lot of momentum. And I think hopefully we're going to see issues do that in races across the country, even with severe gerrymandering.
I agree. I think that this is not looking like a typical midterm. I think New York 19 was proof of that, and I think abortion is the reason.
David, it's always great to have you on, and I look forward to having you on again. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Mike, thank you very much.
David Nir, political director at Daily Kos, and also host of the Down Ballot, which you can listen to podcast, Daily Kos podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts as well. And you can follow David Nir on Twitter at David Nir, Nir. We're back in a few minutes.
The Michelangelo Signorile Show on Sirius XM.